Energy flow in ecosystems. What happens to energy stored in body tissues when one organism eats another? Energy moves from the eaten to the eater. Where it goes from there it depends on who eats whom. A food chain is a series of steps in which organisms transfer energy by eating and being eaten. Food chains can vary in length. An example from the Everglades is shown. We have algae, primary producers, flagfish, first level consumers, largemouth bass, secondary consumers, anhinga, third level consumer, an alligator, fourth level consumer. In some aquatic food chains, such as the example shown, primary producers are a mixture of floating algae called phytoplankton and attached algae. These producers are eaten by small fish, such as flagfish. Larger fish, like the largemouth bass, eat the small fish. The bass are preyed upon by larger, wading birds such as the anahinga, which may ultimately be eaten by the alligator. There are 4 steps in the food chain. The top carnivore is 4 steps removed from the primary producer. In most ecosystems, feeding relationships are much more complicated than the relationship described in a single simple chain because many animals eat more than one kind of food. Ecologists call the network of feeding interactions a food web. An example of a food web in the Everglades is shown next. Each path through a food web is a food chain. A food web, like the one shown, links all the food chains in an ecosystem together. The orange highlighted food chain presented earlier is one of many that make up this web. Arrows in the food web point toward the eater and away from the eaten. So where does the energy flow? The arrow points in the direction of the energy flow. So the algae is eaten by insects, the bluegill, grass shrimp, primary producers, first level consumers, and apex consumer, except for the babies that seem to be eaten also by the gar and the bass and the raccoon. So baby alligators are also prey. Decomposers and detritivores in food webs. Most producers die without being eaten. In the detritus pathway, decomposers convert their dead material to detritus, which is eaten by detritivores such as crayfish, grass shrimp, and worms. Pig frogs kill fish and other fishes eat the detritivores. Decomposers and detritivores in the food webs are like taking apart Lego set. If this one dies, it's not useful anymore. It'll take it into parts. All these parts could then be with the primary producers. They'll remake them into different useful items. When disturbances to food web happen, their effects can be dramatic. For example, all the animals in this food web depend directly or indirectly on shrimp-like animals called krill. Krill are one example of small swimming animals called zooplankton. Krill is right here that feeds on the algae. Herring anchovies, and squid feed on that directly, crab-eating seal, and all of these, the arrows go up. That means that all of these depend on the primary producer, algae, and then the first level consumer, the herbivore, krill. In recent years, krill populations have dropped substantially. Given the structure of the food web, a drop in the krill population can cause drops in the populations of all other members of the food chain. How does energy, biomass, and populations change in the food chain? Each rise in food chain level reduces the following to only 10% of the lower level. So each time you move up the food chain, the amount you have is 1/10 what you had in the lower portion of the food chain. So energy in the first level consumers was 1/10 that of the primary producer. The biomass in the first level consumer is 1/10 that of the primary producer. Population, the number of animals in the first level consumer is 1/10 that of the primary producers. There's 10 times as many plants as there are first level consumers. The reason for this significant loss? Organisms spend much of the energy they acquire in life processes such as respiration, movement, growth, keeping warm, and reproduction. Each step in a food chain or food web is called a trophic level. Primary producers always make up the first trophic level. Various consumers occupy every other level. Some examples are shown in the next few slides. Ecological pyramids show the relative amount of energy or matter contained with each trophic level in a given food chain or food web. There are 3 different types of ecological pyramids: the energy, biomass, and numbers. There's theoretically no limit to the number of trophic levels in a food web or the number of organisms that live on each level. For the energy pyramid, it shows the relative amount of energy available to each trophic level. Only part of the energy that is stored in one trophic level is passed on to the next level. Also, energy is lost as heat at each level. The part that is passed on is 1/10. So if this is 100% of the producers, the first level consumers are only 10%. And then above that, second level consumers is only 1%, and then 0.1% for third level consumers. So biomass pyramid is similar. It represents the amount of living organic matter at each trophic level. Typically, the greatest biomass is at the base of the pyramid. For the grain is 5,000 grams of grain, and for the chickens, 500 grams of chickens, and then we have 50 grams of human tissue. So how much they consume: 5,000 grams of grain, 500 grams of chicken can live on that, and that can be used by 50 grams of human tissue. So in numbers, the pyramid of numbers shows the relative number of individual organisms at each trophic level. So there are many, many, many plants, and 1/10 the amount of animals that might feed on those, and 1/10 of the animals that feed on them could be the animals that feed on those, and then 1/10 of those could be a third level consumer. There are some pyramid anomalies. Generally, a higher level has 10% of a lower level from any change in any of the trophic level pyramids. However, in some cases, consumers are much smaller than organisms they feed on. Thousands of insects may graze on a single tree, for example. The tree has a lot of biomass, but represents only one organism. Or the number of krill eaten by whales is also an anomaly. The number of krill eaten is much greater than 10 times the number of whales feeding.